My name is Laura Sinclair. I am 32 years old. And on a Thursday morning in February, I sat in the front row of Callaway Funeral Home in Hartford, Connecticut, in a black dress I had ironed at 5 in the morning in a hotel room 12 minutes away, and listened to my Uncle Dennis stand at the podium and tell 63 people that my father's estate was going to finally go to the people who deserved it. He looked at me when he said it. Not at my cousin Brett, who had borrowed $40,000 from my father in 2019 and never once mentioned repaying it. Not at my Aunt Carol, who had lived in my father's rental property on Elm Street for 7 years at below-market rent and called it a favor between family. Not at my brother Marcus, who had not called my father in 11 months before the diagnosis and had arrived at the hospital 4 days before the end with a fruit basket and a lot of feelings about the will. He looked at me, because I was the one who had been there. Every appointment, every scan, every Thursday evening when the occupational therapist came and needed someone to take notes because my father's hands shook too much to hold a pen. I was the one who had driven 2 hours each way from New Haven every single weekend for 14 months. I was the one who had sorted his medications, managed his insurance claims, coordinated with the hospice team, and sat beside him on the last night when the room got very quiet and the monitors slowed and there was nothing left to do but hold his hand and let him know that someone who loved him was there. And at the funeral, in front of 63 people, my Uncle Dennis looked at me and said, "Laura has always had a way of inserting herself where she doesn't belong." He said it calmly, conversationally, the way people say things they have been saying for so long they no longer hear how they sound. The room did not correct him. My Aunt Carol nodded slowly. My brother Marcus looked at his hands. And in the front row, 3 seats to my left, a man named Gerald Whitmore folded his program in half and set it very carefully on his knee. Gerald Whitmore was my father's attorney. He had driven from New Haven that morning. He had not been invited. He had come anyway. But before I go any further, welcome to Velvet Revenge Stories. This channel is for women who showed up, who drove the 2 hours and stayed the 14 months and held the hand on the last night, who were there in every way that mattered and were told, in rooms full of witnesses, that they had inserted themselves. If someone has ever looked at everything you gave and called it an intrusion, this one is for you. Drop a comment below, subscribe, and stay with me. Because Gerald Whitmore folded that program and set it on his knee and waited. And what he had been waiting to do had been ready for 11 months. I need to back up to a Sunday in December, 14 months before the funeral. My father called me at 7:43 in the morning. I remember the time because I was making coffee and I looked at the clock when the phone rang because my father never called before 9. He said, "Laura, I need you to come." He said it the way he said things when they were already decided. Quietly, without decoration. I drove to Hartford that Sunday. When I arrived, I found him at the kitchen table with a folder of papers and the particular expression of a man who has been sitting with something difficult for long enough that the difficulty has become familiar. He said, "I've been diagnosed. It's a motor neuron disease. Early stage, but it moves quickly. I've spoken to Gerald. Everything is in order. But I need someone to be here, Laura. Not to manage things. Just to be here." I said, "I'll be here, Dad." He said, "I know you will." And that was the agreement. No contract. No arrangement. Just the understanding between 2 people who had always communicated in plain language. I need you. I'll be here. I know you will. My father's name was Thomas Sinclair. He was 67 years old when he died. He had spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the state of Connecticut, had retired at 62, and had spent the years between retirement and diagnosis doing the things he had always intended to do. Reading, gardening, maintaining a friendship with Gerald Whitmore that had begun in 1989 over a property dispute and had lasted through 34 years and 2 wives and every version of both their lives. My father was precise. He was private. He was not the kind of man who said "I love you" easily or often, but he was the kind of man who showed up when it mattered, and he had raised me to understand that showing up is the language that counts. He had 3 children. Me, Marcus, and my younger sister Julie, who lived in Portland, Oregon, and who had visited twice in 14 months and sent a very large flower arrangement for the funeral, which arrived 3 hours after the service ended. He had a brother, Dennis, who had spent 30 years believing that the Sinclair family assets were a shared resource that happened to be held in my father's name. He had a sister-in-law, Carol, who had been living in his Elm Street rental since 2017 at $600 a month in a unit whose market rate was $1,400. He had a nephew, Brett, who drove a truck he couldn't afford and who had borrowed money from my father the way people borrow from people they have decided will not ask for it back. And he had Gerald Whitmore, who had known him for 34 years and who had sat with him in a law office in New Haven in March of the previous year and documented, with the precision of a man who had done this work for 3 decades, exactly what my father wanted to happen to everything he had built. Let me tell you about the 14 months. I am not going to tell you they were easy because they were not, and anyone who tells you caregiving is a labor of love without also telling you it is simply a labor has not done it. I drove 2 hours each way every weekend. That is 208 hours of driving across 14 months, not counting the emergency trips, not counting the Thursdays, not counting the night in October when the overnight aide didn't show, and I drove to Hartford at 11 p.m. in a thunderstorm and slept on the couch and was back in New Haven for my 9 a.m. meeting the next morning. I am an operations manager at a mid-sized logistics company in New Haven. I have 31 people on my team and a calendar that does not have a lot of room in it for 208 hours of additional driving. I made room. I did not tell my father how much room I was making. I did not keep a record of it for the purpose of being acknowledged. I kept a record of it because I am an operations manager and I keep records of everything, and because my grandmother had once told me that the truth of any situation lives in its specifics, and specific things should be written down. I kept a notebook, a small blue one. I bought it at a CVS in Hartford on the second weekend, because by the second weekend I already understood that the specifics of this situation were going to matter. Date, time, what was done, who else was present, what was said. 14 months of Sundays and Thursdays and emergencies and ordinary evenings. All of it. In small blue notebooks. 3 of them by the end. I did not show anyone the notebooks. I did not mention the notebooks. I simply kept them. Because specific things should be written down. And because my grandmother was right about most things. Dennis arrived at my father's house for the first time in 4 months in November, 3 weeks before the end. He arrived with Carol and Brett and a covered dish of something that smelled like it had been made from a casserole kit. And he sat in my father's living room and talked about the family home and the rental property and the investment account with the comfortable ease of a man who has already decided how a story ends and is simply waiting for the last chapter to close. My father was in the hospital bed. We had moved to the downstairs bedroom in September. He could hear them. I know because when I went in to check on him after they left, he was awake and his eyes were open and he said, "They came then." I said, "Yes." He said, "I expected it sooner." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "The notebook, Laura. Keep the notebook." I said, "I have it." He said, "Gerald has everything. You know that." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "I just want you to know that I know what you've done. And I know what they haven't." He said it simply, without sentiment. The way he said everything that mattered. Then he closed his eyes. And 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, with his hand in mine and the monitors slowing, he was gone. The funeral was on a Thursday. 63 people. Callaway Funeral Home. A service my father had planned himself, down to the music and the order of the readings, because Thomas Sinclair was not going to leave the details of his own farewell to other people's judgment. Gerald Whitmore sat in the front row 3 seats to my left. He had driven from New Haven. He had not been invited because the funeral arrangements had been managed by Dennis, who had presented himself to the funeral home as the family representative and who had not thought to include the family's attorney on the guest list. Gerald came anyway. He sat in his coat with his program folded on his knee, and he listened to the service, and he listened to Dennis's eulogy, and he listened to the moment when Dennis looked at me in front of 63 people and said, Laura has always had a way of inserting herself where she doesn't belong. He listened to the silence that followed. He listened to Carol's slow nod. He listened to Marcus studying his hands. And then he stood up. Not immediately. Not dramatically. He stood up the way men stand up when they've been waiting for the right moment and the right moment has arrived. He said, "I apologize for the interruption." He said, "My name is Gerald Whitmore. I was Thomas Sinclair's attorney for 34 years. I'm here because Thomas asked me to be here." The room turned. Dennis's expression shifted the way expressions shift when a situation has changed and the person inside it has not yet decided how to respond. Gerald said, "Thomas was very specific about a number of things. One of them was that I be present when his family was together for the first time after his passing. He anticipated that certain things might be said. He wanted me available to provide clarity." He looked at Dennis. He said, "I can do that now if you'd like. Or I can do it at the formal reading next week." Thomas left the choice to me. Dennis said, "This is not the appropriate time or place." Gerald said, "I think Thomas thought it was." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed an envelope. A standard legal envelope, sealed, with my father's name written on the front in my father's handwriting. He said, "Thomas prepared a letter to be read in the presence of the family. He asked me to read it at the first gathering where his children and his brother were in the same room." He looked at me. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Dennis and Carol. He said, "This qualifies." And then, in the quiet of Callaway Funeral Home on a Thursday morning in February, Gerald Whitmore opened my father's letter and began to read. My father's letter was 4 pages long. I did not know it existed until that moment. Gerald had not told me. My father had not told me. That was deliberate, Gerald explained later. My father had not wanted me to carry the knowledge of it during the 14 months, because he did not want my presence at his side to be about the letter. He wanted it to be about what it was. He wanted me to show up because I loved him, not because I knew what was waiting. That was Thomas Sinclair. Precise. Private. And in this, quietly, profoundly right, Gerald read the opening lines. "To my family. If you're hearing this, I am gone. I hope the service was what I planned. I've done my best to leave things in order, and I have one final thing I'd like to say while I have the room." The chapel was completely still. Dennis had sat back down. Carol's hands were folded in her lap. Brett was looking at the floor. Gerald continued. "For the past 14 months, one of my children has been present in my home and in my life in the way that children are present when they love someone without condition. She drove 2 hours each way every weekend. She managed my medical appointments, my medications, my insurance, and my hospice coordination. She slept on my couch when the aide didn't come. She was there on the last night. She was there for most of the nights before it. Her name is Laura." Gerald paused here. Just for a moment. The room was the kind of quiet that has weight. He continued. "I have 3 children and I love all 3 of them. But love is not the same as presence. And presence is not the same as sacrifice. And I want the people in this room to understand the difference before they leave today, because some of them have had something to say about Laura's role in my care, and I want to address that directly." Laura inserted herself into nothing. She was asked. She came. She stayed. Every single time. Dennis's jaw was very still. Gerald read on. "To my brother Dennis and to Carol, your family, and I love you. But the rental on Elm Street has been at $600 a month for 7 years, and the market rate has been $1,400 for 4 of them. I kept records. Gerald has them. The difference will be reconciled from the estate before distribution." Carol looked at Dennis. Dennis did not look back. To Brett. "I have a signed acknowledgement of the $40,000 you borrowed in 2019. I did not ask for it back because I hoped you would offer. You didn't. It will be reconciled from your portion of the estate before distribution." Gerald turned the page. The room was not breathing. To Marcus, "I know the last 11 months were hard for you. I know you had reasons for the distance. I don't hold it against you. But I want you to understand that the person who was there when you were not was your sister, and whatever you feel about the estate, I want you to know that." Marcus finally looked up from his hands. Then Gerald reached the final section. My estate, including the family home on Birchwood Drive, the rental property on Elm Street, the investment account at Northfield Capital, and all remaining assets, I leave to my daughter Laura and Sinclair in full. Dennis made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. Gerald did not pause. This is not a punishment. This is an accounting. I have been watching what people do when they believe no one is counting, and I have been counting since the day I understood that I was not going to be here to count much longer. Laura kept 3 notebooks. I've read them. Gerald has copies. The specifics are in the record. He said, I see what people do. I always have. I just stopped mentioning it. This is what I leave behind. Not a judgment on my family, but a record of what happened. The record is accurate. The record is the will. Gerald folded the letter. He placed it back in the envelope. He looked at the room. Dennis was on his feet. His voice came out loud enough that people in the back rows shifted in their chairs. He said, This is not legal. This will be contested. You cannot do this. She manipulated him. She was there every week because she was positioning herself. Everyone in this room knows it. Gerald said, Mr. Sinclair, your brother retained me in 2019. In the 3 years before his diagnosis, we reviewed and updated his estate documents on 4 separate occasions. The will you are referring to was drafted in March of last year, when your brother was of full legal capacity as confirmed by his physician in writing. It was witnessed by 2 people who are not beneficiaries. It was notarized by my firm. It is valid. He said it the way people say things when they are not interested in being argued with. He said, You are welcome to retain counsel and pursue a contest. That is your right. I would encourage you to review the supporting materials Thomas left before you decide. He was thorough. Dennis looked at me. I looked back. Not with triumph. Not with the performed steadiness of someone who has been waiting for a moment. Just with the ordinary steadiness of a woman who drove 2 hours each way for 14 months and sat on a couch in a thunderstorm and held a hand in the dark and kept 3 small blue notebooks because specific things should be written down. I said nothing, because my father had already said everything. Dennis did retain counsel. His attorney reviewed the will, the capacity letter, the physician's documentation, and the 3 notebooks Gerald submitted as supporting material. The contest was withdrawn 6 weeks later. I found out on a Monday morning while I was at my desk in New Haven reviewing a logistics report. Gerald called at 8:47. He said, It's done. I said, Thank you, Gerald. He said, Your father was a very careful man. I said, I know. He said, He was also right about most things. I said, I know that too. I sold the rental on Elm Street. Not immediately, not vindicatively, but in the spring, when Carol's lease expired and she did not offer to renew at market rate and I did not offer to discuss it. I kept the house on Birchwood Drive. I am not living in it. It is not the right time. But I am not selling it either, because it has a garden in the back that my father planted in 2015 and maintained with the precision he brought to everything, and the garden is still producing. And something that was tended that carefully deserves more than a transaction. I visit on Sundays. I bring the 3rd blue notebook, the one I didn't finish, and I sit on the bench beside the garden and I write down things that matter. Not because anyone is going to read it. Because specific things should be written down. And because that was what my father believed, and he was right about most things, and the things he was right about are worth carrying. Like they always say, the people who call your presence an intrusion are always the ones who were absent when the presence was needed. My Uncle Dennis stood at a podium in front of 63 people and said that I had a way of inserting myself where I didn't belong. He said it in a room where my father's attorney was sitting 3 seats to my left with a 4-page letter in his coat pocket. He said it to the wrong person, in the wrong room, on the wrong day. And the letter said the rest. My name is Laura Sinclair. I am 32 years old. I am an operations manager in New Haven, Connecticut. I drive to Hartford on Sundays. I keep 3 small blue notebooks in the bottom drawer of my desk at home. I don't read them anymore. I don't need to. Everything in them is already true, and the truth has already done what truth does when it is documented carefully and left in the right hands. It speaks. Without being raised. without being performed, without needing anyone to point at it and say, look. It simply speaks. That is my story. One funeral, one letter, one attorney who drove from New Haven without being invited because a very precise and private man had asked him to. And 3 small blue notebooks that turned out to be the most important documents in the room. If this reminded you to keep the record, to write down the specifics, to trust that the truth does not need you to announce it, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. Tell me what moment hit you hardest. Hit subscribe. And I will see you in the next one.